I remember the exact moment she walked onto my stage like it was yesterday. There she was, this 24-year-old woman named Emily Thompson, shoulders squared, chin lifted in that way people do. When they're bracing for a fight, they've already lost 100 times in their own head. Her eyes locked on mine, not with anger exactly, but with this raw, exhausted defiance that said, "You think you know me? Try harder." And right behind her sat her parents and her older brother, faces tight with the kind of worry that comes from loving someone so much, it started to feel like fear. That opening hook of an entrance told me everything I needed to know before a single word was spoken. This family wasn't here because someone was out of control in the loud, obvious ways you see on the news. No, this was the quiet kind of chaos that eats away at a household from the inside, where love has twisted into control and independence has been mistaken for destruction. I've sat across from thousands of people in my career, but episodes like Emily's stay with you because they're not about one big dramatic blow-up. They're about the slow burn of misunderstanding that can tear a family apart if nobody steps in and calls it what it is. Let me be clear from the start, because that's how I operate. I'm Dr. Phil, and over the years, I've made it my business to cut through the noise and get to the truth, no matter how uncomfortable it gets. This wasn't some sensational case for ratings. This was a young woman whose family genuinely believed she was spiraling out of control, and she was there to tell her side of the story, to push back against the label they'd slapped on her like a scarlet letter. Emily wasn't violent. She wasn't stealing or abusing drugs in the streets. But from her parents' perspective, she had become unpredictable, unreliable, and dangerously detached. She dropped out of community college after 2 semesters, bounced between dead-end jobs, moved in with a boyfriend they couldn't stand, and spent money she didn't have on things that seemed frivolous to them: tattoos, late-night drives, impulsive trips with friends they didn't know. To them, she was reckless, selfish, and headed for disaster. To her, they were suffocating, judgmental, and completely blind to the fact that she was trying to find her own path in a world that had already told her she wasn't good enough. That central problem wasn't just about behavior, it was about identity. Emily carried the weight of being the problem child, the one who never quite fit the mold her high-achieving family had set. And I could see in her eyes that she was tired of carrying it alone. What struck me immediately was how articulate she was when she finally spoke. "My family thinks I'm out of control," she said, voice steady but edged with something fragile underneath. "And this is my side of the story." Those words hung in the studio air like a challenge. I leaned forward in my chair, the way I always do when I want someone to know I'm really listening, not just waiting for my turn to talk. I told her right then that I wasn't there to take sides. I was there to understand the patterns, because patterns don't lie even when people do. Her mother, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s who worked as a school administrator, wiped her eyes and described nights she lay awake wondering if Emily was safe. Her father, a retired military man with a handshake like a vice, talked about the calls from creditors, the unanswered texts at 3 a.m., the way Emily would disappear for days and come back acting like nothing had happened. Her brother, 2 years older and already climbing the corporate ladder, sat there with his arms crossed, looking equal parts protective and exhausted. They all loved her. That was never in question. But love without understanding becomes a cage, and Emily felt locked inside it. As I began peeling back the layers with her that day, I could already sense the backstory forming like a map only she could read. Emily grew up in a household where structure was everything. Her father's military background meant rules weren't suggestions, they were survival. Her mother compensated by overfunctioning, trying to keep the peace by anticipating every need and smoothing over every bump. Emily was the youngest, the surprise baby who came along after they thought they were done. From the time she was little, She watched her brother excel in everything, sports, grades, leadership, and she felt the invisible pressure to match it. But she wasn't wired that way. Where he thrived on order, she craved freedom. I've seen this dynamic hundreds of times in families, the golden child and the black sheep, except the black sheep isn't bad, she's just different. Emily told me about being 10 years old and getting grounded for a month because she stayed out 15 minutes past curfew to watch fireflies in the backyard. 15 minutes. That's the kind of moment that plants a seed. You tell a kid that their natural curiosity is dangerous, and eventually they start believing the only way to be themselves is to rebel in bigger and bigger ways. By her teenage years, the pattern was locked in. She started pushing boundaries harder, skipping classes, dyeing her hair wild colors, dating boys her parents disapproved of on sight. It wasn't about the boys or the hair. It was about proving she existed outside their blueprint. Her parents responded the only way they knew how: tighter rules, more lectures, more disappointment in their voices. The more they tightened the grip, the more she slipped through their fingers. She learned to hide things, to lie by omission, to create little pockets of autonomy that felt like oxygen. That's the tragedy I see so often. The very behaviors parents fear are the ones their control creates. Emily wasn't out of control in the clinical sense. She was in survival mode, fighting for a sense of self she'd never been allowed to develop without guilt. I watched her face as she described it, the way her shoulders relaxed just a fraction when she realized I wasn't jumping to her family's narrative. That's when the real conversation could begin. We talked about how her first serious relationship at 19 became her escape hatch. The boyfriend was older, had his own apartment, worked odd jobs, and didn't ask her to be anything but who she was in that moment. To her parents, he was a loser who was dragging her down. To Emily, he was proof that someone could love her without trying to fix her. When that relationship ended badly predictably, because she was still figuring out who she was, she spiraled into a depression. She didn't have the language to name. Instead of seeking help, she doubled down on the behaviors that made her feel alive. Late nights, impulsive spending on clothes and experiences that let her forget the emptiness for a few hours. Her family saw chaos. I saw a young woman who had never learned how to sit with discomfort because discomfort had always been met with criticism or control. That's the psychological piece people miss. It's not laziness or entitlement. It's a nervous system that never learned safety and stillness. Her parents shared stories of finding empty pill bottles, not hardcore drugs, but anxiety medication she'd gotten from a friend and never refilled properly. They found credit card statements for tattoo parlors and road trips to cities she'd never been to before. They'd tried tough love, cutting her off financially, begging, threatening to change the locks. Nothing worked, they said, because she wouldn't listen. Emily's response was calm but cutting, because listening to you means disappearing. I've been disappearing my whole life to make you comfortable. That line hit the studio like a quiet bomb. I could see her brother shift uncomfortably, her mother's hand fly to her mouth. This wasn't a kid acting out anymore. This was an adult trying to explain that her version of control looked like freedom to everyone else. I've spent decades studying human behavior, and what I observed in Emily was classic differentiation, or the lack of it. She hadn't been given the space to become her own person without it feeling like betrayal. Every choice she made that didn't align with the family script was labeled as out of control. And the more they labeled it, the more she leaned into it, because at least then she had an identity, even if it was a negative one. It's the same pattern I've seen in countless episodes. The harder the family pushes to fix the problem child, the more entrenched the problem becomes. Emily wasn't broken. She was fighting for air in a room where everyone else thought the windows were already wide open. We were only 20 minutes into the taping, but I already knew this story was going to unfold in layers. Her family had brought her here out of desperation, convinced that 1 hour with me would magically make her see reason. Emily had agreed to come because she was exhausted from defending herself and secretly hoping someone outside the family bubble would finally hear her. That's the central tension that makes these cases so compelling, the collision between you're destroying your life and you're destroying me by not letting me live it. I've learned you can't resolve that in sound bites. You have to go deeper, back to the beginning, and trace every thread until the real picture emerges. And that's exactly what we did next, step by careful step, because the truth doesn't reveal itself when you're in a hurry. It reveals itself when you're willing to sit in the discomfort long enough for it to speak. I kept my eyes on Emily as the conversation deepened because I've learned that the real breakthroughs don't come from grand speeches. They come from the small moments when someone realizes they're being truly seen for the first time. She described how her early 20s became a battlefield of small rebellions that felt enormous to her family. After the breakup, she moved back home briefly, but the tension was unbearable. Every dinner turned into an interrogation. Where were you? Who were you with? Why can't you just get a real job? Her father would sit at the head of the table, jaw set like he was briefing troops, reminding her that life isn't a vacation and that she was wasting her potential. Her mother would try to soften it with concern, but the message was the same. You're not measuring up. Emily told me she started staying out later just to avoid those conversations, crashing on friends' couches, picking up bartending shifts that kept her schedule completely opposite from theirs. She wasn't trying to hurt them, she was trying to breathe. But from their perspective, every late night confirmed their worst fears. She was out of control, unreliable, and drifting further away. That's when the escalation really began to build, layer by layer, like a storm you can see coming but can't quite outrun. Her parents started tracking her phone location, something they admitted to with a mix of shame and justification. We were worried sick, her mother said, tears welling up. She wouldn't answer our calls for days. Emily countered that the constant checking made her feel like a criminal in her own life, so she'd turn the location off or leave her phone at home on purpose. The fights got louder. One night, after she came home at 4 a.m., smelling of cigarettes and cheap beer, her father lost it. He told her if she couldn't follow the rules under their roof, she needed to leave. Emily packed a bag that same night and moved in with a coworker she barely knew. To her, it was liberation. To them, it was proof she was spiraling. Money became the next flashpoint. She'd maxed out a credit card on a tattoo sleeve she'd been dreaming about for years, an intricate design of wildflowers and broken chains that symbolized everything she felt inside. When the bill came, she couldn't pay it, and her parents ended up bailing her out because they couldn't stand the thought of her credit being ruined. But the bailout came with strings, lectures, guilt trips, and the unspoken expectation that she'd finally grow up. Her brother tried to play mediator at first, sitting her down for what he called real talk. He told her she was embarrassing the family, that their parents were aging and didn't deserve this stress. Emily fired back that she was tired of being the family scapegoat, the one who absorbed all the disappointment so everyone else could feel successful. The arguments escalated into screaming matches where old wounds were ripped open. She accused them of never really knowing her, of loving the idea of who they wanted her to be more than who she actually was. They accused her of being selfish, immature, and blind to how her choices affected everyone around her. I've seen this pattern so many times in my career, the blame shifting that happens when fear takes over love. Parents blame the child for not listening. The child blames the parents for not understanding. Nobody is fully wrong, but nobody is fully right either. The misunderstanding grows until the family dynamic becomes a pressure cooker, and eventually someone suggests coming on the show because they've run out of other options. By the time they reached my stage, The escalation had reached a breaking point. Emily had been living on her own for 6 months in a tiny studio apartment she could barely afford. She was working 2 jobs, one at a coffee shop during the day and waitressing at night, but her schedule was erratic and she'd missed several rent payments. Her parents had received a call from her landlord threatening eviction, and that was the final straw. They showed up at her door unannounced, demanding she come home or let them help her get back on track. The confrontation at her apartment was ugly. Her father raised his voice in a way he hadn't since she was a teenager. Her mother cried and pleaded, and Emily felt cornered. She told them she'd rather be homeless than go back to living under their microscope. That's when her brother stepped in and suggested they all come see me. Surprisingly, Emily agreed. Not because she thought I had all the answers, but because she was exhausted from fighting alone, and part of her still hoped her family could hear her if someone neutral was in the room. As I sat there listening to both sides lay out their versions, I could feel the tension crackling in the air. This wasn't just about Emily's behavior anymore. It was about years of accumulated resentment, unspoken needs, and patterns that had become so automatic no one questioned them. Her parents truly believed they were acting out of love, trying to save her from herself. Emily truly believed she was fighting for her right to exist as her own person. Both sides were operating from pain, and pain makes people rigid. I've learned that in these situations, the escalation often hides the real issue. A failure to differentiate between guidance and control, between concern and criticism. Emily's family had good intentions, but their methods were pushing her further into the very behaviors they feared. She was reacting, not acting, and that reaction looked like chaos to them. I turned to Emily and asked her directly, "When did you first start feeling like your family's love came with conditions?" She paused, eyes glistening, and told me about being 13 and coming home with a C on a math test. Her father's disappointment was palpable. Her mother immediately signed her up for tutoring. No one asked how she felt or what was going on in her life. From that moment, she said, she learned that approval was performance-based. Good grades, good behavior, good choices, those earned love. Anything less earned lectures or silence. That's the kind of backstory that shapes a person's entire approach to relationships. She carried that into adulthood, expecting that any vulnerability would be met with judgment, so she armored up with defiance instead. Her parents, on the other hand, came from generations where struggle was met with discipline, not exploration. Her father's military service taught him that structure saves lives. Her mother's own upbringing in a chaotic home made her desperate to create stability at all costs. Neither side was malicious. They were just repeating what they knew. The more we unpacked the escalation, the clearer it became how the family system had become dysfunctional. Every time Ger tried to assert independence, it triggered her parents' anxiety, which triggered more control, which triggered more rebellion from her. It was a vicious cycle, and nobody knew how to step off the merry-go-round. Her brother admitted he felt caught in the middle, loving his sister but resenting the way her choices dominated family conversations. It's like we can't have a normal holiday without it turning into a crisis about Emily, he said. Emily shot back that she never asked to be the center of their universe, that she just wanted space to make her own mistakes. I nodded because I've heard variations of this script hundreds of times. The central problem isn't the mistakes themselves. It's the inability to let someone make them without it becoming a referendum on their worth as a person. I could see the exhaustion in all their faces. They'd been carrying this for years and it had worn them down. Emily looked thinner than she should, dark circles under her eyes from too many late shifts and too little sleep. Her mother's hands trembled when she spoke about the fear of losing her daughter completely. Her father sat ramrod straight, but his eyes betrayed the worry he tried to hide behind sternness. This was a family that loved each other deeply but had forgotten how to show it without conditions or fear. The escalation had brought them here to this stage because they'd run out of private solutions. Now it was time for the hard part, the confrontation, where I would hold up a mirror to each of them and ask them to look honestly at what they saw. I leaned in closer and addressed Emily first because she was the one carrying the heaviest label. You say your family thinks you're out of control, but let me ask you this. Are there any areas where your choices have actually created problems you can't deny? She hesitated, then nodded slowly. She admitted the credit card debt, the unstable housing, the way she'd ghosted her family during her lowest points because facing their disappointment felt worse than being alone. I didn't let her off the hook. I told her straight, the way I always do, that rebellion for rebellion's sake isn't freedom. It's just another form of being controlled by the need to prove something. True independence means taking responsibility for your life, not running from accountability. She pushed back at first, eyes flashing with that same defiance I saw when she first walked out. You don't know what it's like to feel erased by the people who are supposed to love you most. I nodded and said, "You're right. I don't know your exact pain, but I know what it does to a person when they believe their worth is tied to someone else's approval. And right now, you're still letting their disapproval define you, even as you fight against it." Then I turned to her parents. To her father, I said, "You raised her with discipline because you thought it would protect her, but has it occurred to you that your version of protection has started to feel like prison to her?" He stiffened, but I could see the crack in his armor. He talked about watching friends' kids go down bad paths and vowing it wouldn't happen to his daughter. I acknowledged the fear, but challenged him. Fear-based parenting creates fear-based children. To her mother, I pointed out that over-functioning, always rescuing, always smoothing things over robs a child of the chance to develop resilience. You think you're helping, I told her, but you're actually teaching her that she can't handle life without you stepping in. That's not love. That's dependency dressed up as concern. Her mother cried openly then, admitting she didn't know any other way. The confrontation wasn't easy. Emily defended herself fiercely at times, accusing me of siding with her family. Her brother jumped in to defend their parents. Voices rose, tears flowed, and there were moments where it felt like the whole thing might derail. But that's where the real work happens in the mess. I kept bringing them back to the core. What do you need from each other that you're not getting? For Emily, it was acceptance without conditions. For her parents, it was reassurance that she wasn't going to self-destruct. For her brother, it was peace in the family again. I pushed them to own their parts without blame shifting. Emily had to acknowledge that some of her impulsivity was hurting her own future, not just defying her parents. Her father had to see that his rigidity was pushing her away rather than guiding her. Her mother had to learn to step back and let natural consequences teach lessons she couldn't force. There was one moment that stands out as the potential breakthrough. Emily broke down when I asked her what she was really afraid of if she stopped fighting so hard. Through tears, she admitted she was terrified of failing on her own terms and proving them right that she was out of control and couldn't make it. That vulnerability cracked the wall she'd built. Her parents listened, really listened, without interrupting for the first time. Her father reached over and took her hand, something I suspect he hadn't done in years. He told her he was scared too, scared of losing her, scared he hadn't done enough as a father. In that raw exchange, I saw the first glimpse of what real connection could look like when defensiveness drops. Of course, one conversation on stage doesn't fix years of patterns. I knew that going in, but I gave them concrete tools. Family counseling to learn healthy boundaries, individual therapy for Emily to build self-awareness and emotional regulation, clear agreements about financial help without strings attached to control. I challenged Emily to create a realistic plan for stability budgeting, consistent work, addressing the anxiety she'd been self-medicating. I told her parents to practice stepping back, to express love without demands, to celebrate small steps instead of demanding perfection. The brother was tasked with being a support, not a judge. As the taping wrapped, the energy in the room had shifted. It wasn't magically resolved. There were still hurts to heal and habits to break, but there was a new willingness to try. Emily looked exhausted but lighter, like she'd set down a burden she'd carried alone for too long. Her parents seemed more open, less armored. I reminded them all that change isn't linear, that there would be setbacks, but the real measure of success would be how they handled those setbacks together instead of against each other. In the weeks that followed, I stayed in touch through follow-ups the way I often do with cases that touch me. Emily started therapy and actually stuck with it, something she credited to finally feeling heard rather than judged. She got a better job with more stable hours and began paying down her debt on her own terms. There were still arguments, but they were shorter and ended with apologies more often than slammed doors. Her parents attended counseling and learned to listen first, advise second. The family started having monthly dinners without an agenda, just time to be together. It wasn't perfect, and it never would be. Families rarely are, but they were communicating instead of colliding. Emily reached out to me months later to say thank you. She said the show didn't fix her, but it gave her the permission to stop seeing herself through her family's fearful eyes. She was still figuring out who she was, still making mistakes, but now she owned them instead of rebelling with them. Her family was learning to trust the process, to see her growth even when it didn't look like their version of success. That's the outcome I hope for in every case like this. Not perfection, but progress. Not control, but connection. Not blame, but understanding. Looking back on that episode, I'm reminded why I do this work. It's not about quick fixes or dramatic transformations on camera. It's about shining a light on the patterns that keep people stuck and giving them the tools and the courage to choose differently. Emily's story wasn't unique in its pain, but it was powerful in its honesty. She came in carrying the weight of being labeled out of control, and she left with the beginning of a new narrative, one where she was in control of her own life, on her own terms, with a family that was learning to love her through the mess instead of trying to clean it up for her. That's real change. That's what matters. And that's why these stories stay with you long after the lights go down. I sat back in my chair that day on stage, watching the family dynamic play out in real time, and I could feel the weight of all those unspoken years pressing down on every one of them. Emily had just shared that raw admission about her fear of failing on her own, and the room went quiet for a beat, the kind of silence that happens when truth finally cuts through the noise. Her father's hand on hers looked awkward at first, like a man who'd forgotten how to offer comfort without conditions, but it was there, and that small gesture told me we were moving into the confrontation phase where real shifts become possible. I didn't rush it. I've learned you can't force breakthroughs. You create the space for them by asking the hard questions that nobody else has been willing to ask in the safety of their own living room. I turned my attention fully to the parents and said, "You both came here convinced your daughter is out of control, but let me ask you something straight. What if the control you've been trying to exert is actually what's keeping her from growing up?" Her mother's face crumpled a little, and she started to defend herself, talking about all the times they'd rescued Emily from bad decisions, paying for the car repair after she rear-ended someone because she was distracted on her phone, covering the security deposit when she moved into that questionable apartment complex. I stopped her gently but firmly. I hear the love in that, I really do. But every time you step in and fix it, you're sending the message that she can't handle life without you, and she's hearing that loud and clear, which is why she keeps pushing harder to prove she doesn't need you or anyone. Emily nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. And for the first time, I saw her shoulders drop like the armor was getting too heavy to hold up anymore. Her father spoke up then, voice gruff, but cracking at the edges. He talked about his own upbringing, how his dad had been tough as nails, and it had made him the man he was today, disciplined, responsible, able to provide for his family. I just wanted the same for her, he said. The world is hard, Dr. Phil. I didn't want her to learn that the hard way. I acknowledge that fear because it's valid. Parents carry the scars of their own past and project them onto their kids, thinking they're protecting them when they're actually repeating cycles. I told him, discipline without connection creates rebellion. You gave her rules, but did you give her the emotional safety to come to you when she messed up? He looked down at his hands and I could see the wheels turning. That's the moment I push for the one where defensiveness starts to crack and self-reflection creeps in. We dug deeper into the confrontation, layer by layer. I had Emily face her family directly and list out the specific behaviors that had hurt them the most, not as an attack, but as ownership. She took a breath and admitted the lying, telling them she was at work when she was really out with friends avoiding responsibility. She owned the financial mess, how she'd ignored bills, because facing them felt like admitting defeat. But then she turned it back on them. The constant criticism that made her feel worthless, the way they compared her to her brother until she stopped trying to compete. Every time I tried to do something my way, you acted like it was a personal failure for you, she said, voice rising. Her brother jumped in, defending their parents, saying she was exaggerating, that they'd only wanted the best for her. I held up a hand and reminded everyone that this wasn't about who was right, it was about understanding the impact. Intentions don't erase the effect, I told them. You can love someone with all your heart and still damage them with how you show it. The pushback was real. Emily got angry at one point, standing up and pacing a few steps before sitting back down. You all think I'm the problem, but have you looked at yourselves? Mom, you hover so much I can't breathe. Dad, you bark orders like I'm one of your soldiers. And you, she pointed at her brother, you act like you're perfect, but you barely call unless it's to lecture me. I let the emotion flow because suppressed feelings are what fuel these cycles. Then I brought it back to analysis. This is classic family systems theory at work. One person gets labeled the identified patient, the out-of-control one, so the rest of the system doesn't have to look at their own dysfunction. But the truth is, the whole family is out of balance. I explained how her parents' anxiety about her future was manifesting as control, which triggered Emily's avoidance and rebellion, which increased their anxiety in a never-ending loop. Her brother's role as the responsible one kept him emotionally distant, protecting himself from the chaos, but also missing out on a real relationship with his sister. I shared some of the psychological insights I've gathered over decades. Emily's impulsivity wasn't random. It was a trauma response to feeling emotionally unseen. Growing up with conditional love creates an inner critic that's louder than any external voice. So she silenced it with distractions, late nights, new tattoos, spontaneous adventures that gave her a temporary hit of I exist, I choose this. Her parents' over-involvement came from their own unresolved fears of failure as caregivers. I told them straight, you're not bad parents. You're scared parents doing what you think is right based on limited tools. But fear is a terrible compass for raising adults. They listened, and I could see the shift starting. Her mother admitted she'd been so focused on preventing pain that she'd prevented growth. Her father acknowledged that his military mindset didn't translate well to parenting a free spirit like Emily. The confrontation hit its peak when I asked each of them to say what they needed from the others moving forward without blame. Emily went first. I need you to trust that I can fail and get back up without rescuing me every time. Stop treating me like I'm broken. Her mother's response was tearful but honest. I need to know you're safe, but I'll work on letting you show me instead of assuming the worst. Her father struggled more, but he managed, I need you to communicate instead of disappearing, and I'll try to listen without jumping to solutions. Her brother added that he wanted his sister back, the one he used to play with as kids, not the stranger he worried about constantly. These weren't polished statements. They were raw, halting, filled with the awkwardness of people who'd forgotten how to talk without fighting. But they were real, and that's where breakthroughs live, in the messy honesty. I didn't sugarcoat the work ahead. I told Emily that being in control of her life meant more than doing whatever she wanted. It meant facing consequences, building discipline on her own terms, and learning to regulate her emotions instead of numbing them. She had to stop using her family as the excuse for her choices and start owning her future. To the family, I said the tough truth. You can't control her, and trying has only made things worse. Your job now is to support without smothering, to set boundaries without ultimatums, to love her even when her path looks different from yours. I recommended specific steps, weekly family check-ins with no agenda except listening, individual therapy for everyone to unpack their roles, and a clear financial plan where help came with accountability, not control. As the hour wound down, I could see the exhaustion mixed with a glimmer of hope. Emily wasn't suddenly transformed into the perfect daughter, and her family wasn't magically relaxed and trusting. But something had shifted in the way they looked at each other. The confrontation had stripped away some of the labels out of control, controlling, perfect son, and left them facing each other as flawed human beings who loved each other and wanted to do better. I reminded them that change takes time, consistency, and the willingness to fail forward. This isn't the end of the story, I said. It's the beginning of a new chapter where you write it together instead of against each other. In the follow-up months after the show aired, I kept tabs on their progress the way I do when a case sticks with me. Emily started seeing a therapist who specialized in family of origin issues, and she began journaling her triggers instead of acting on them impulsively. She kept her waitressing job and added a part-time gig at a local bookstore, something that fed her creative side without the chaos of night shifts. She paid her own rent for the first time in years. And when she hit a rough patch with a bad breakup, she called her mother not for money, but just to talk. That small step meant everything. Her parents attended couples counseling and learned techniques to manage their anxiety without projecting it onto Emily. Her father even took up a hobby woodworking that gave him an outlet for his need for structure outside of parenting. The brother started reaching out more casually, inviting Emily to grab coffee instead of lecturing her about life choices. There were setbacks, of course. Emily relapsed into old patterns once, missing work for a week after a fight with her roommate, and the family almost fell back into rescue mode. But this time they caught it. Her parents offered emotional support, but let her handle the consequences herself. Emily reached out to her therapist instead of disappearing. Those moments of choosing differently built new neural pathways, the kind that turn reactive behavior into responsive choices. I've seen it time and again. When people stop fighting the old battles and start building new skills, the family system begins to heal. Emily's outcome wasn't a fairy tale ending with everyone living happily under one roof. She stayed in her own apartment, continued working on her independence, and slowly rebuilt trust with her family. They started doing things together again, simple things like Sunday brunches or weekend hikes, without the underlying tension of "is she okay?" dominating every interaction. She even got a small tattoo to cover part of an old one, a symbol she chose with intention this time, representing growth instead of rebellion. Her parents learned to celebrate her small wins, like when she budgeted enough to take a solo weekend trip without asking for help. They still worried that never fully goes away, but the worry no longer dictated their relationship. Looking back, what stands out most is how Emily's side of the story changed the narrative for all of them. She came in feeling like the villain in her own family saga, carrying the weight of being out of control. Through the confrontation, she discovered she wasn't the problem. She was the symptom of a system that needed recalibration. Her family saw that their love, while genuine, had been expressed in ways that inadvertently pushed her away. The real victory wasn't perfect behavior, it was the shift from blame to accountability, from control to collaboration, from fear to faith in each other's ability to grow. I often think about cases like Emily's when I'm reflecting on my years doing this work. They remind me that families are complex organisms, not machines you can fix with one conversation. The pain runs deep, the patterns are stubborn, but the human capacity for change is remarkable when people feel safe enough to try. Emily taught me once again that behind every difficult child is a person desperate to be understood, and behind every controlling parent is a person terrified of watching their child suffer. When you bring those truths into the light and hold them with both honesty and compassion, healing becomes possible, not easy, but possible. The story didn't end on the stage that day. It continued in the quiet daily choices each of them made afterward. Emily is still figuring out her path, still making mistakes, but now she owns them with less shame and more self-awareness. Her family is still learning to let go while staying connected. Together, they're writing a new chapter where love doesn't require perfection and independence doesn't require isolation. That's the kind of outcome that matters most, the realistic, grounded kind where people do the hard work and come out stronger on the other side, not because everything is fixed, but because they finally understand each other enough to keep trying. I remember sitting there on stage, the lights warm on my face, watching the subtle shifts in body language as the confrontation continued to unfold in ways that went far beyond the scripted hour we had. Emily's tears had dried, but the vulnerability lingered in her eyes, and I could tell she was wrestling with whether to lean into the honesty or retreat back into the safety of her old defenses. I've been doing this long enough to know that the real work often happens in those in-between moments when the adrenaline of the argument fades and the deeper fears start to surface. So I leaned forward again and said, Emily, you've spent years proving you're not the problem child they labeled you as. But tell me this, what would it look like if you stopped proving anything and just started building something for yourself? She paused, really thinking about it, and then described a future that surprised even her. A stable job she didn't hate, maybe going back to school part-time for something creative like graphic design, relationships where she didn't have to hide pieces of herself. It wasn't a grand vision of success. It was simple, grounded in hers. Her family listened without interrupting, and I saw her mother nod slowly as if she was beginning to see her daughter not as a project to fix, but as a young woman with her own dreams. That was progress, the kind that doesn't make for flashy television, but sticks with you because it's authentic. We kept digging into the psychological roots because I've learned you can't just address the behavior, you have to understand the wiring behind it. Emily talked more about her childhood, how she'd always felt like the odd one out in a family that valued achievement above all else. Her brother had been the star captain of the debate team, straight-A student, the one who made their parents beam with pride. Emily was the dreamer, the one who got lost in books and art and music, the one who brought home doodles instead of report cards full of perfect scores. The subtle messages she absorbed were clear. Your worth is tied to what you produce, not who you are. When she rebelled, it wasn't because she wanted to hurt them. It was because rebellion felt like the only way to claim space for the parts of her they didn't celebrate. I explained to the family how this creates an identified patient dynamic where one person carries the symptoms of the whole system's imbalance. Emily wasn't out of control by nature. She was responding to a system that left no room for her authentic self. Her parents opened up more during that confrontation, sharing their own backstories in ways they probably hadn't in years. Her father recounted his military days, the deployments, the rigid hierarchy that kept him alive and sane in chaos. He admitted that when Emily came along as the unexpected late baby, he applied the same principle, structure equals safety. But he never considered that what worked for soldiers might crush a sensitive, creative child. Her mother shared how her own parents had been emotionally distant, leaving her to fend for herself, so she overcompensated by trying to be the perfect, involved mom. Every time Emily pulled away, it triggered her fear of repeating her own lonely childhood. I pointed out how these intergenerational patterns get passed down like invisible scripts. Nobody chooses them consciously, but until you name them, they control you. The escalation in their family had been the inevitable result of those scripts colliding control versus freedom, fear versus exploration, expectation versus reality. I pushed the confrontation further by having them role play a typical fight from home, right there on stage. It was uncomfortable, voices rising again as old wounds reopened, but it gave me the chance to interrupt and show them the pattern in action. See how quickly it escalates, I said? You start with concern, it turns to criticism, she defends with sarcasm or silence, and everyone ends up feeling attacked and unheard. They saw it, the blame shifting, the assumptions, the way love got lost in a delivery. Emily admitted she used sarcasm as armor because direct vulnerability had always been met with dismissal. Her father saw how his tone, even when he meant well, came across as commanding rather than caring. Her mother recognized that her helping often felt like invalidating Emily's ability to handle things herself. That mirror I held up wasn't gentle, but it was necessary. People don't change when they feel judged. They change when they see the cost of staying the same. The breakthrough moment came when Emily turned to her family and said something I'll never forget. I don't want to be the rebel anymore. I want to be me, and I want you to love that version even if it's messy. Her voice broke, and for the first time there was no defiance, just raw hope. Her brother reached over and hugged her awkwardly, muttering that he missed his little sister. Her parents both cried, her father apologizing for the first time in perhaps decades for making her feel like she had to earn his love. In that instant, the confrontation shifted from battle to bridge. It wasn't magic and it wasn't complete healing, but it was the crack where light could enter. I reinforced it by reminding them that breakthroughs are fragile. They require daily practice to turn into lasting change. I gave them practical tools right there, communication exercises like using I feel statements instead of you always, boundary setting guidelines where help came with clear expectations rather than guilt, and a commitment to individual and family therapy sessions after the show. Emily agreed to a 90-day plan, consistent work hours, therapy twice a week, no major financial decisions without a budget review she created herself. Her parents committed to stepping back, no more surprise visits or tracking apps, and expressing pride in her efforts, not just outcomes. The brother promised to be an ally, not a critic. I warned them all that setbacks would happen, that old patterns die hard, but the measure of success would be how quickly they recovered and returned to the new way of relating. As we wrapped the onstage confrontation, I felt the energy in the room had changed. It was still heavy with emotion, but there was a tentative hope mixed in. Emily looked drained but lighter, like she'd released something she'd been holding for years. Her family seemed more united, less divided by roles of rescuer and rebel. I told them straight, the way I always do. This isn't a quick fix. Families don't heal in an hour. But if you do the work, you can build something stronger than the dysfunction you walked in with. In the months that followed the taping, I followed up with calls and check-ins because cases like this matter to me. They represent the quiet battles so many families fight behind closed doors. Emily started therapy and stuck with it, learning to identify her triggers and respond instead of react. She found a steadier job at a local design firm as an assistant, something that played to her creative strengths without the burnout of service industry chaos. She began paying her bills on time, slowly chipping away at the debt, and even started a small savings account for the first time. When she felt the pull of old impulsive behaviors like wanting to quit a job after a bad day, she called her therapist or journaled instead of disappearing. Those small choices added up to real momentum. Her parents kept their word on stepping back. They attended their own counseling sessions and learned how to express concern without control. Her mother stopped offering unsolicited advice and started asking open questions like, "How can I support you?" instead of, "Why don't you just..." Her father worked on softening his tone and celebrating Emily's independence, even when it looked different from what he envisioned. They still worried, but they channeled it into their own self-care rather than projecting it onto her. The family dinners became less about interrogation and more about connection, sharing stories, laughing about old memories, and occasionally talking about the future without pressure. There were challenges along the way, as there always are in real life. Emily had a setback about 4 months later when she lost her job due to a company downsizing and spiraled briefly into old habits, staying out late, avoiding calls. The family felt the old panic rise, but this time they handled it differently. Instead of rushing in to fix it, they offered emotional support and encouraged her to problem solve. Emily reached out for help from her therapist and landed a new position within weeks. That moment became a turning point, proving to everyone that they could navigate hard times without falling back into the old cycle. Her brother became a more active part of her life, inviting her to his apartment for game nights and listening without judgment when she shared struggles. The sibling bond that had been strained by years of comparison started to heal. Emily even began mentoring a younger coworker who reminded her of herself, passing on some of the lessons she was learning about self-worth and boundaries. It was beautiful to see how her pain was turning into purpose. The outcome wasn't flawless. Emily still had moments of doubt and impulsivity, and her family still had moments of overworry, but they communicated through it. She moved into a better apartment she could afford on her own, started dating someone who respected her independence, and even considered community college classes, again, not because they pressured her, but because she wanted to grow. Her parents expressed pride in her progress without attaching strings. They took a family vacation together for the first time in years, and it went well. No major blow-ups, just time to enjoy each other's company. Reflecting on Emily's story now, I see it as a powerful reminder of what I've always believed. People are capable of change when they feel truly seen and supported. Emily came in carrying the heavy label of being out of control, convinced her family would never understand her side. Through the honest confrontation and the hard work afterward, she reclaimed her narrative. She wasn't perfect, but she was progressing, building a life that felt authentic to her while repairing the relationships that mattered most. Her family learned that love doesn't mean control. It means standing beside someone as they find their own way, even when the path looks messy. That's the kind of outcome that makes this work worthwhile. Not dramatic transformations caught on camera, but quiet, sustained growth that ripples through a family for years. Emily's side of the story wasn't just about rebellion or rescue. It was about the courage to be honest, the willingness to own your part, and the strength to choose connection over being right. In the end, they didn't just survive the conflict, they began to thrive in a new way of being together. And that, to me, is what real healing looks like. I've thought a lot about that day on stage with Emily and her family, replaying the moments in my mind long after the cameras stopped rolling, because these stories don't end when the credits roll. They continue in the quiet decisions people make when no one is watching, and that's where the real measure of change reveals itself. Emily had walked onto my stage carrying years of being seen as the family wild card, the one whose every move seemed to confirm her parents' deepest fears that she was out of control and headed for disaster. But as we moved through the confrontation and into what came after, I watched something remarkable happen, not a Hollywood turnaround, but a slow, honest recalibration of how they related to one another. That's the kind of outcome I respect most. The grounded kind that holds up in real life, not just under studio lights. In the follow-up sessions I arranged, Emily opened up more about the internal battle she'd been fighting. She described how, even after the show, the old voices in her head still whispered that she was failing, that any stability she built would crumble, because that's what the problem child was supposed to do. I reminded her, as I had on stage, that those voices were echoes of conditional love, not truth. We talked about rewiring that inner critic through consistent small actions, showing up for therapy even when she didn't feel like it, tracking her spending in a simple notebook instead of avoiding it, reaching out to a friend for support instead of isolating when anxiety hit. She started practicing what I call responsibility, the ability to respond thoughtfully rather than react impulsively. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was the foundation for genuine independence. One day she told me she'd turned down a spontaneous weekend trip with old friends because she had rent due and knew the consequences of blowing the money. That choice, small as it was, marked a shift from rebellion to responsibility. Her parents' growth was just as important, maybe more so, because change in the system starts with the leaders changing their approach. Her father began journaling his own triggers, the moments when fear made him want to tighten the reins and practice pausing before speaking. He told me in one check-in that he realized his military background had taught him to lead by command, but fatherhood in peacetime required something different. Leadership by example and connection. He started sharing stories from his own youth, the mistakes he'd made before he found structure, which helped Emily see him as human rather than just an authority figure. Her mother worked on her tendency to overfunction by setting personal boundaries, like taking up a painting class she'd always wanted to try but had put off for family needs. That small act of self-care modeled for Emily that it was okay to have your own life without guilt. The couple attended sessions together where they learned to communicate needs without blame, turning "you're worrying me sick" into "I feel anxious when I don't hear from you. Can we find a way to stay connected that respects your space?" The brother played a quiet but pivotal role in the outcome. He admitted he'd distanced himself emotionally to avoid the family drama, but after the show, he made conscious efforts to rebuild the sibling relationship. They started texting about everyday things, funny memes, recommendations for books or shows, without the underlying agenda of fixing her. That lightness helped Emily feel seen as a person, not a project. He even confided in me that watching his sister own her struggles gave him permission to look at his own perfectionism and the pressure he'd put on himself to be the reliable one. The whole family was healing in parallel, even if the spotlight had been on Emily. Of course, real change is never a straight line, and there were setbacks that tested everything they'd started building. About 7 months after the taping, Emily hit a rough patch when her new job at the design firm demanded longer hours and she started feeling the old burnout creep in. She skipped a couple of therapy appointments, let her apartment get messy, and almost ghosted her family during a stressful week. The old pattern tried to reassert itself, parents worrying, wanting to step in, Emily pulling away to prove her independence. But this time the response was different. Instead of accusations or rescues, her mother sent a simple text: "I'm here if you want to talk, no pressure." Her father resisted the urge to call and lecture, choosing instead to wait for her to reach out. When Emily finally did, after a few days, she was met with listening instead of solutions. She later told me that moment felt like proof that the confrontation on stage had planted real seeds. She got back on track, adjusted her schedule, and even asked her boss for a slight modification that showed she was learning to advocate for herself without burning bridges. Those kinds of tests are where I see the true outcome take shape. It's easy to look good on television. It's harder to sustain the work when life gets messy again. Emily started incorporating daily practices that grounded her morning walks, where she practiced mindfulness, budgeting apps that gave her a sense of control without overwhelm, creative outlets like sketching designs in her free time that reminded her of the dreamer she'd always been. She began dating someone new who respected her boundaries and encouraged her growth, a far cry from the relationships that had once been escapes. Her self-worth started coming from internal validation rather than external rebellion or approval. Her family side of the evolution was equally profound. They stopped using the phrase "out of control," even in private conversations, replacing it with curiosity. How are you feeling about things? They celebrated milestones that previously would have gone unnoticed. Emily cooking a meal for herself instead of ordering takeout, paying off a chunk of debt, showing up consistently for work. Her parents learned to express pride without attaching expectations, saying things like, "We're proud of the effort you're putting in," rather than, "Finally, you're doing it right." That shift reduced the pressure on Emily and allowed her to relax into the relationship instead of bracing for judgment. I checked in with them nearly a year later, and the changes had solidified into a new normal. Emily had enrolled in a few online courses for graphic design, not because anyone pushed her, but because she saw value in building skills that aligned with her interests. She was managing her finances well enough to afford a slightly better living situation, and even started a small side hustle creating custom illustrations for friends and local businesses. The impulsivity that once defined her had diminished, replaced by thoughtful decision-making and a willingness to ask for help when she genuinely needed it without shame. She told me she no longer felt like she had to choose between being herself and being loved. Both could coexist now. Her parents described their home life as calmer, more connected. Family gatherings no longer carried the undercurrent of tension. They took vacations where the focus was enjoyment rather than monitoring Emily's choices. Her father even joked during one call that he was learning to be a retired general in a family, not in charge of one. Her mother shared that she slept better at night, no longer lying awake running worst-case scenarios. The brother had become a genuine friend to Emily, and they occasionally collaborated on small projects like helping her with a website for her illustration work. The outcome wasn't perfect, and I never pretend it is. Emily still had days when old doubts crept in, when she questioned if she was doing enough or moving fast enough. Her family still felt twinges of worry when she went quiet for a day or two. But they had tools now: open communication, individual accountability, and a shared understanding that love doesn't require control or perfection. They knew how to repair ruptures instead of letting them escalate into full-blown crises. That resilience is what separates families that survive from those that thrive despite differences. Reflecting on Emily's story, as I often do with cases that touch the core of human struggle, I'm reminded of a fundamental truth I've seen proven again and again: people aren't defined by their worst moments or their most rebellious phases. They're defined by their capacity to learn, adapt, and choose connection over isolation. Emily came to me labeled as out of control, but what I saw was a young woman fighting desperately for authenticity in a family system that hadn't made space for it. Her side of the story deserved to be heard, and once the confrontation stripped away the blame and revealed the pain underneath, everyone could begin the real work of rebuilding. This wasn't a story of dramatic redemption, where everyone hugs and the credits roll with swelling music. It was quieter, more realistic, and in my experience, far more powerful. Emily built a life that felt like her own. Her family learned to love her without needing to reshape her. Together, they created a new dynamic where independence and connection could coexist. The labels faded: problem child, controlling parents, perfect brother, replaced by something more honest. People doing their best, learning from the past, and moving forward with greater awareness and compassion. I've sat with thousands of families over the years, and episodes like this one reaffirm why I keep showing up. Because behind every out-of-control label is a human being with a story worth understanding. Behind every fearful parent is a deep love that got twisted by their own unhealed wounds. When you bring those stories into the light, hold them with straight talk and genuine empathy, and equip people with practical tools, real transformation becomes possible. Not overnight, not without setbacks, but steadily, one honest conversation and one courageous choice at a time. Emily's journey taught me once again that the strongest families aren't the ones without conflict. They're the ones that learn how to navigate it without losing each other. She no longer has to tell her side of the story as a defense. She lives it now with clarity, with accountability, and with the quiet confidence of someone who finally knows she is enough exactly as she is, even while still growing. And her family walks alongside her, not trying to steer every step, but simply present, loving, and learning right there with her. That, to me, is the best possible outcome any of us can hope for.